Back in 2015, I made a video covering and demystifying the infamous Mandela Effect. For those of you unfamiliar, allow me to recap. The Mandela Effect is the given name to a widespread phenomenon in which a large group of people remember an event or detail that never actually occurred or existed. In essence, a mass false memory. The most notable of which, and where the strange occurrence gets its name, involves the late Nelson Mandela. Many swear by the idea that Mandela had passed away during his imprisonment in the 1980s, when in actuality, he didn't pass away until late 2013. This false recollection made its way around the internet and eventually gave birth to a theory, one that suggests that the Mandela Effect could be explained by parallel dimensions colliding, the result being a chunk of the population either unknowingly being from an alternate universe, or that somehow they acquired the memories of events that occurred in one. It's clear that a large number of people just aren't on the same page here, but as I discussed in my Mandela Effect video, it's much more likely that what these people are experiencing is some form of misinformation rather than the aftermath of worlds colliding. Now, on top of this, there are many studies in the field of psychology that explore the idea of false memories and everything surrounding them. Other examples of the Mandela Effect covered in my last video include the Berenstain-Berenstein debate, US citizens remembering 49, 51, or 52 states as opposed to the accurate 50, Tank Boy, a video in which a protester either does or does not get run over by a tank depending on who you ask, and the deaths of various celebrities who are very much still alive, such as Morgan Freeman or Stan Lee. These are just a few amongst the many, many examples out there, and while I debunked this batch, there are still a lot more to go around. That brings us to today's Mandela Effect of choice, an album by the Beatles from the 1970s entitled Everyday Chemistry, an album that doesn't actually exist. For those of you unfamiliar, the group released their final record Let It Be in 1970 and broke up that same year. Okay, so now this is where I can stop talking all formal-like. Now, before I get into why this isn't at all proof of a parallel universe, allow me to explain the backstory of Everyday Chemistry and how it spread. Bear with me here, because we're going into some serious tinfoil hat territory. In fact, take a picture of yourself in one and I'll retweet it, no joke. Anyway, back on topic. Everyday Chemistry traces back to a website called thebeatlesneverbroakeup.com. On the site, a man going by the alias James Richards recounts a rather strange experience that left him in possession of the album. According to James, on September 9th of 2009, he was out for a drive before pulling over after he noticed his dog getting restless. His dog managed to get loose, causing James to chase after the pet and accidentally trip, leaving him unconscious. James later woke up in what he described as a room filled with electronics. There he met a man named Jones who claimed to have found him roughly 20 feet from his home. This confused James since the area he was driving through was supposed to be at least 20 miles away from anything. Jones began explaining to James that he was actually in what he referred to as Parallel Earth, a place much like the universe James was used to, only with slight differences. One being that the Beatles never broke up. Everyday Chemistry was the man's proof. Anyway, after this strange encounter, James claimed that he was put in a parallel travel machine and beamed back to his car in the middle of nowhere. I know, I smell the bullshit too. Now, in case this is the first time you've heard of Everyday Chemistry, or if you're not a fan of the Beatles, then allow me to point some things out. Things that believers of this story seem to completely ignore for some reason. I'm going to be using the first track as an example. Of course, I won't play it here lest I face the wrath of the almighty copyright gods, as if we don't already have enough issues with crap being demonetized, but anyway, the opening song goes by the title Four Guys. Listening to it, it sounds pretty much like what you'd expect from the Beatles, only with a 1970s vibe. Again, a little past the band's time, at least in our universe. The problem here, which is obvious to any fan of the Fab Four, is that the track mainly consists of samples from George Harrison's When We Was Fab and Paul McCartney's Band on the Run. This method of composition rings true throughout the entirety of Everyday Chemistry. And in case you're confused right now for some reason, what I'm saying is that what you hear on Everyday Chemistry is indeed the Beatles, just not them together. It's a mashup album consisting of each member's solo work after they parted ways. Now, this was brought up to both James and believers in his story, and this is how they chose to debate it. According to their logic, the individual ideas of John, Paul, Ringo, and George would have existed anyway even if the Beatles had stayed together, hence making something like Everyday Chemistry an absolute possibility. If you have a brain, however, then you'll know it's much more likely that some just made a mashup album. I'm just saying. So what's the deal with James? The internet currently actually doesn't have an answer. Why go through all the trouble of creating a backstory and website just to promote a magical mystery mixtape? One would assume it's also possible that James was a, for lack of a better term, tinfoil hat type himself and actually did get knocked unconscious in the middle of nowhere and happened to believe the story of this so-called Jones guy. As for the other crazy little bits like the parallel travel machine, if James actually believed his story, it could also be possible that he suffered brain damage during his accident. And just to be clear, I'm not at all banking on any of these theories. It's way more believable that a diehard Beatles fan created a mashup album and wanted to play with the idea of what could have been had the Beatles stayed together or maybe reunited. The silver lining here, because there very much is one, is that Everyday Chemistry may have a made-up backstory, but the album actually isn't bad at all. If you are a Beatles fan and you haven't heard about it yet, then I'd highly suggest looking it up on YouTube as just a fun little what-if sort of thing. Like I mentioned earlier, this is just one of many things people consider proof of the Mandela Effect and its parallel universe theory. If there are any others you'd like to hear me explain or debunk, then go ahead and tweet them at me. One last thing I wanted to say before I go is that my 3rd anniversary here on YouTube is coming up in a few weeks, and I will be having a marathon to celebrate the occasion. Details will be released via my social media, so don't forget to check those out. Anyway, thank you so much for an amazing 3 years so far, and I'll see you all again soon.